Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Peter Craftle. I'm Professor of Human Geography here at the university and also Deputy Head of the College of Life and Environmental Sciences. But more importantly, for the purposes of this afternoon's event, I'm also a long-time collaborator and friend of Sophie's. So a very warm welcome to everyone this afternoon. It's a real privilege to open this inaugural lecture, having worked with Sophie for over 15 years. There are a few people I'll give a special mention to in my introduction. Firstly, Sophie's family and friends. I know most of you are not local and have made a special effort to be here this afternoon, for which we, and especially Sophie, are really grateful. Particular thanks to Sophie's dear family friends from the USA who've planned their trip to be able to be with us today. Welcome to the UK and welcome to Birmingham. Sophie also wanted me to thank her secondary school teacher, Jane Prescott. We can all remember that one teacher who went that extra mile and inspired us. Jane is with us this evening, and I'm sure we'll be proud of the Sophie who stands in front of us today. Sophie began her geographical life at the University of Leicester, completing her BA in geography, her master's and her PhD there. Professor Jenny Pickrell was instrumental in this journey, being her undergraduate tutor, dissertation supervisor, and then PhD supervisor. Sophie's PhD research took her to India, where she found herself navigating the complexities of interviewing the CEOs of major banks. It was towards the end of Sophie's PhD when she and I met. I'd recently started at Leicester and we were recruiting for a postdoctoral researcher on a research project on children, young people, and their experiences of new communities. We recruited Sophie to work with Professor John Horton at the University of Northampton. This was the start of her journey into children's geographies, bringing together the wonderful ways she engages with children and young people and with geographical inquiry. At the end of that project, she was offered an ongoing position at the Centre for Children and Youth in Northampton, working on a range of commissioned projects related to young people's lives. It was at this time that she was also developing her own ESRC Future Research Leaders Grant, and the success of this funding application was part of her move to the University of Birmingham as lecturer. Over the last 12 years, Sophie's excelled in research and in education, becoming an international leader in the field of children's geographies, with work spanning young lives not only in the UK, but also in India and Brazil. She's held key positions within the subdiscipline, including the chair of the Royal Geographical Society's Geographies of Children, Youth and Families Research Group, and as editor for our flagship journal, Children's Geographies. Sophie's known widely for the impact of her work in collaboration with a range of international, national, and local organisations, demonstrating her commitment to making young people's lives and environments better. Over the years, she's played an active role in inspiring the next generation of geographers through outreach programmes and facilitating the transition of young people to university. Most recently, Sophie's taken on the role of Deputy Head of School, a role she's doing with her usual level of collegiality, kindness, professionalism, and commitment. During the past decade, she's also welcomed 2 children into her family, Thomas and Evie. In taking on this dual role of parenthood and academic, she's committed to trying to strike a balance between the two. As a female academic with a young family, she feels it's important to be visible and share both the struggles and the opportunities that this brings. The culmination of all that Sophie's achieved was her promotion to Professor in Human Geography in 2022. As someone who's followed Sophie's journey from PhD student at Leicester to Professor here at Birmingham, it's been an absolute pleasure to watch this as a colleague, mentor, and a friend. So please join me in welcoming Sophie to give her inaugural lecture, What It Means to be a Children's Geographer, People, Projects, Policy, and Place. Sophie.
Thank you, Peter, for that really kind introduction. And thank you to all of you who have made it here today. And welcome to the University of Birmingham for those who have never been here before. Those of you who are joining online from around the world, and to the children and babies in the room, welcome. So, I forgot I have to press it too. I began this process by doing a mind map of all the possible topics, the key points, perhaps the stories that I might want to cover. I then thought about who was going to be in the room and online, and it of course includes my friends and family who have lived with me through all of this. Then the leaders in their own geographical fields, the policymakers sitting in local and national governments, as well as my international collaborators. So to cover all of these bases is quite a task. And outside academia, it might be friends on the school gates or my wider family, they often say, but what is it that you do? And I went on a course as an early career academic, and a takeaway moment was they said that we had to prepare an elevator pitch. So you need, just in a sentence or two, and just enough time before those doors open, you have to excite, influence, and you have to make sure that they're going to remember you. So I've tweaked it a bit over the years, but I generally say that I'm a children's geographer who does social and spatial research with children and young people, with the ultimate aim of making cities and urban areas better for children and young people. So then for this audience then, I wanted to focus on what it means to me to be a children's geographer. I've researched with over 5,000 children and young people in diverse contexts, and I'm going to use their experiences to speak to some themes, to speak to the themes of care, inequality, and failure, and ask critical questions of what's next for how we prioritize young people's needs, their values, and their experiences in the urban realm. But as a children's geographer, I can't not reflect a little on my own childhood. And I can see a couple of our third-year geographers sitting in the room, and we asked you to do this a few weeks ago. So I wanted to do this to show you how it shaped the Sophie that stands here today. So there are 5 moments I wanted to share. Firstly, I've always been keen on projects, writing it all down, keeping the cuttings, the offcuts, the receipts. I've always known there's a researcher in me. Whether it's those geography projects, I can't say Jane, sorry, Mrs. Prescott, or the biology project that I did, here it is, on the bodily impacts of smoking, or writing up science experiments, I found joy in the process of doing it, reflecting on it, and then seeing it complete. Then there are the diaries. I've kept every diary I've written since I was about 10. So that's just over 30 years worth of diaries, averaging 1 a year, plus quite a few notebooks here and there. And I've managed to squeeze them all into 2 boxes. So what's in them? The science lessons, the homework, the lists I used to write, notes from school friends, little drawings. I often get asked by my husband, what exactly are you going to use these for, Sophie? But you never know when they're going to come in handy. For a start, it's a 30-year log of life. And again, the researcher in me sees this as a unique opportunity to look back on childhood. From early on, I wanted to be a doctor. This was mostly shaped by Mum and I watching Casualty in Holby City on Saturday nights. And so for my work experience, I went to, in year 12, I went to the Children's Hospital School at the Leicester Royal Infirmary. And they allowed me to shadow teachers who were working on the wards. And this was a real eye-opening experience. Meeting children with long-term illnesses, some even terminal diagnoses. And many of these children I encountered, it was the structure of education in their day that gave them the hope and the joy within that hospital environment. And really, I think it was this experience that cemented that I wanted to work with children and young people. My next reflection comes from being involved in a research project. I was a 10-year-old, and the project was on neighborhood crime. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, recounting my experiences to a researcher. And I remember her attentiveness to my experiences and her child-led approach really stuck with me. Fast forward then to my time as a postdoc. It was my turn sitting in the interviewer seat. I worked on a project with the police to understand victims' journey through the criminal justice system. I interviewed over 50 children who had been victim to some of the most horrendous crimes, and hearing their stories via the research really shaped how that local force learnt lessons about engaging with children who were victims. So why did I end up doing geography at university? Well, I was on the cusp of making a decision, choosing universities via UCAS, and we had a talk from a geography professor at our school, the late Professor Jonathan Young. I can't quite remember what the title of the talk was, but I do remember thinking, I want to do geography and I want to do it at Leicester University. And this was again a pivotal point. Later that year, there was a school-based competition. It was to design a project for a research talk happening here at the University of Birmingham by the GA, the Geographical Association. It was about drinking water, and I won the competition. And I still even have given those boxes the letter of thanks. It's got your name on it too, Jane. So it was these combined experiences of the professor speaking at our school and the competition that shaped my trajectory here at Birmingham. I have over the years built relationships with local schools, local students, and have worked with colleagues to inspire the next generation of geographers. So collectively, these experiences then, including my love of projects, writing, diaries, lists, working with children and young people, have culminated in the making of me. And these moments have all shaped how and why I've become a children's geographer. So who then has supported me on this journey? Here I've put photographs of a group who I would like to acknowledge, because in some way or another, they've shaped my academic journey. And when I look at all these pictures, I see 5 groups of people. First, there are the mentors. There are the official mentors and unofficial. They're the ones who I've called on those pivotal moments, the ones who have helped me make those decisions, who have read the job applications, helped me with funding bids, asked critical questions of my ideas and sometimes quite grand plans. Second, there are those who have been with me for the firsts. My first undergraduate tutor in my first seminar, my first line manager, my first postdoctoral researcher, my first PhD student, my first international collaborator. Firsts are always a bit scary, but when you're supported by people who are rooting for you, like these people on the screen, it really makes those firsts so much easier. And then third, there's a group up there who have made me think differently about geography, children, and childhood. These people might not realize they've shaped me in the ways that they have, in such a profound way, but it's a real privilege to be surrounded by people who are critical thinkers, and that's really important. And to have such diverse experiences and encourage me always to think in new ways and push for better, more equitable and fairer childhoods. The fourth group I see up here is a collective. Some of you are in the room, others are online, and others couldn't be here today. For all of you, regardless of career stage, your geographical research area, your willingness to do your best for children and young people is really an inspiration. So thank you to all of you for your input into me. And I'm excited for continued collaborations, conversations, and importantly, our care for each other. I also have to say that it isn't very often that you have time to really think about who's supported you. And just sitting there putting together this matrix of profile pictures, it really struck me that I've been so privileged to have been supported by so many people. And also being surrounded by so many women who are leaders, who really challenge the status quo and who are great mentors is something that I'm very grateful for. Then finally up there's a blue box. And that wasn't because I couldn't find who to fill that final space, but it was to represent the hundreds of others who have become part of me. Colleagues here in the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences, my students who have over the years themselves been crucial to shaping me as an academic, and of course, all of those children and young people I've encountered as part of my research. So to all of you, I'm very grateful. And at this stage, I wanted to mention, whilst this is a presentation about the work that I've led and been involved in, none of it would have happened without the collaborative work of a large number of people. So before I go into some of the projects, I just wanted to give a bit of an insight into some of the methodologies that I use to get closer to understanding children and young people's lives. Much of what I do is grounded in ethnography. So it means we spend time with people in places, in the communities that we work with. In the UK, India, and Brazil, we've spent months, sometimes a whole year, living in and interacting with the children and families that are part of our research. And it's a huge privilege to be able to do this type of work, to get to know the participants and their families and build trust in this research process. I use traditional qualitative methodologies, including peer and individual and family interviews and workshops, which is supplemented with community engagement activities and more creative methods, including drawings, competitions, mapping, and guided walks. I'm also known for my work with mobile applications, co-designing apps with children and young people, and I'm going to come on to that a bit later on. I'm passionate about the ethical work with children and young people and their families, and I'm proud of the work that I've done in that space. Just a little bit about the structure of the remaining presentation. I've decided to focus on a few of those projects that I've been working on, that I've led or been involved in, and to share some key findings from that research. But I'm going to do that via sharing the experiences and stories of a number of children and young people who have shaped my thinking as a researcher and my trajectory. So first then, I'm going to take you back to that police project that I was part of when I was a postdoc researcher. So it was commissioned by the police to understand victims' journey through the criminal justice system. And I was asked to interview Sarah, a 12-year-old girl living in Northamptonshire. She was victim of assault and bullying from her neighborhood peers. Her dad was in prison, and she was being victimized because of this. And during the interview, when speaking about her feelings about being a victim, she said to me, and I remember it as if it was yesterday, she said, "I cope by throwing my feelings away. I write them on a bit of paper, and I throw the paper in the bin. I can't tell my mum." So inside of me, my alarm bells were ringing. Why couldn't she speak to her mum? And we chatted at the end about the reason she couldn't tell her mum. And it was because she didn't want to burden her anymore. It was stressful with dad being away in prison. And Sarah felt that giving those problems to her mum would just be a step too far. So I couldn't leave Sarah knowing she didn't have anybody to talk to. So together we decided that we would speak to her mum. And I remember them sitting there on the floor, hugging each other, sobbing. So these emotional and social vulnerabilities are at the heart of so much of the work that we do in children's geographies. And navigating this ethical terrain is really quite tricky at times. Children's geographers, we're not social workers, but we are exposed to many of the everyday realities of children's lives and the harshness of many childhoods. So this brings me on to talk about Jessica, a 10-year-old who took part in our project on New Urbanism's New Citizens, understanding what it was like to be a young person growing up in a new sustainable community in the UK. In this project, I worked with young participants for over a year, and particularly in year 6 of their schooling. I interviewed them multiple times about various aspects of their lives of living in new communities. I was taken on guided walks around the developments. I spent time getting to know them and getting to know them in school. And the first interview was set up as a getting to know you interview about how long they'd lived in the new development and their everyday life. What I wasn't prepared for was the level of detail about home life and interactions with parents. As Jessica went through the details of her everyday routine, I remember being worried. I was worried for what she was doing as a child. I was worried that I was the only one that perhaps she'd told about this. She told me she would get home from school, as soon as she would do that, she'd take over from her mum. She had a younger sibling at home who was 1. She'd play with her sibling, give her tea, put her to bed, and feed her in the night when she woke up. Dad worked away for months at a time, and her mum had chronic fatigue. So yes, Jessica was in full-time education, but when she wasn't In school, she was being a carer for her sibling. She talked so matter-of-factly about it. This was her routine and her life. So on the one hand, I was really quite aware that my actions, whatever actions I then take, could have quite serious implications on that family. But again, together, Jessica and I decided we should speak to the safeguarding lead in the school post-interview, and Jessica agreed. The school didn't know about Jessica's caring work in the home, so this was a disclosure. And actually, in my first week as a postdoc, this was one of 4 disclosures. So it was really quite a learning curve. Talking about everyday life with young people gives them the freedom to talk about being groomed online, their carrying of knives to school to make them feel safe, and the potential of abuse within the family. Our questions to young people make them feel listened to, but they just need to be aware at the start of the interview and the research process that we have a moral and ethical obligation to keep them safe, and nothing that they tell us as researchers is confidential. So this encounter and others like it have shaped my ongoing engagements with children and young people to this day. So next we come to Marco. We met Marco as part of our Reconnect the Nexus project in Brazil, where we were looking at the food, water, energy nexus and young people's experiences of this. As part of the project, we surveyed nearly 4,000 young people, which was the largest survey on these kinds of issues. We did interviews, a nexus mapping exercise where we asked young people to visualize their everyday interactions with food, water, and energy, exploring their spatio-temporalities of food. So the drawing up here on the screen is Marco's representation of his store cupboard at home. And I'm going to use the example of Marco to challenge 2 assumptions about children and their everyday engagements with food, water, and energy. First then, the assumption that food, water, and energy is just about food, water, and energy. So the visual mapping exercise highlights the complexity of young people's entangled spatio-materialities of food and water and energy, which stretch beyond that nexus triad to involve transport, infrastructures, employment, education, and money. So this was Marco's nexus web. And with his drawing, he describes the choices that his family has to make with the little money they have. He explains that they can't afford to buy the special food. They only buy necessary food. So in his store cupboard, he had the staples of rice, beans, oil, and pasta. The family here were really key in young people's experiences of the nexus. We found that families bridge the gap in the nexus through caring when times are tough, and this was extended to neighbors and to religious spaces. But then we found also that the family were also a weakness in that nexus, particularly when alcohol and drugs are involved in family life. So these webs and accompanying narratives really show how food, water, and energy is woven into everyday life and challenges that initial assumption. Assumption 2 then, that nexus threats, challenges, and system processes are critical at the macro scale. Much of the scholarly work on understanding resource use and urban metabolisms has generally been quite abstract from everyday processes, which tend to emphasize the critical nature of understanding those nexus threats at the macro scale. But in our research, the body was really a key component of young people's articulation of the nexus. Young people were really keen on telling us about how their bodies were a key actor in processing, managing, negotiating, sensing, and learning about the nexus. Visualizations of their bodies formed a key part of the webs, from relatively simple stick figures to intricate drawings of the gut and internal organs, and the role in food processing and energy production. Young people told us how their senses were attuned to monitoring nexus threats, from drinking water quality to river pollution. And our research with young people like Marco showed that the micro scale of understanding the nexus was just as vital in terms of the impact on bodies and how different bodies manage and negotiate nexus threats. Next, we meet Nisha, definitely Nisha. Nisha lives in an informal settlement in Delhi. I met Nisha as part of some work I was doing with Hamara Bachpan campaign, an NGO who were working with children and young people to advocate for safe and healthy environments for children growing up in informal settlements. I'd been invited to speak at an event in Delhi on child-friendly cities, and I was speaking about a mobile app I'd developed called Map My Community. And after I'd given the presentation, the NGO approached me after the talk, and they were interested in using the app as part of their child mapping work in various communities across Delhi. So I ended up applying for a pot of money for the organization and young people to work on their own version of the app, a co-designed version which was suitable for their needs and requirements and relevant to that local context. And it was at this stage that I met Nisha. Nisha was a child advocate for the NGO. She was born and had grown up in the informal settlement. She spoke about the dangers of women and girls using communal toilets at night, the lack of play spaces for children, poor drainage and poor sanitation. So let's see what this looked like in practice. So this was the process that we went through with the Map My Community app. So young people attended various workshops that we led across Delhi to explain what the app was and how they could potentially adapt it for their own lives. We had obviously the parents and the young people consent to participate. The project lent them mobile phones. And then in small groups accompanied by youth leaders, they used the app then in their communities. And then once all that data had been collected and visualized, they then used that with stakeholders to showcase kind of that data and how that could then inform policy and practice. In all the work that I've done with the app, and I'm really passionate about how we've been able to make that culturally appropriate and sensitive in our research interactions. With this project, we had to spend time with the parents and the children working on the translation of the app and in training sessions. You can see Nisha here. She's the one sitting in the middle by the computer. She's working with a group of parents. And supported by us, she led the session to make it relevant and appropriate for her local community. We worked in 5 areas across Delhi and 21 informal settlements with 105 young people. Children would take photographs of spaces where they play, where they meet with their friends, their homes and communal spaces. They would highlight the open sewerage, areas of poor sanitation, and places that they thought could be improved with some lighting, clearing of the waste, or investment with community infrastructures. The young advocates and the NGO used that evidence that we collected as part of that app to then campaign for change in their communities. Not too long after the project and the work that had been done with the local authorities, a huge waste dumping ground had been cleared and made into an open space for children to play. The photograph there on the top left. And in another community, a sewerage system had been installed, all as a direct result of young people's experiences, voices, and actions. And this was a really great example of where urban data generated by children and young people can be used to campaign for change. Really, the mobile app and the visualization of the data that we've been working on here at Birmingham was nothing more than a way of expressing young people's voices and experiences. And the involvement that I had with Nisha and other young people and that NGO really impacted on the way that I think about impact, working with communities led by them and their needs. A few years after this, I was at the UN Habitat World Urban Forum in Ecuador, and there was Nisha. She was standing center stage as part of a youth panel to an international audience of government officials. And she spoke to me after about the opportunities that being involved with the NGO and our app work here at Birmingham and as a child advocate had given her. So meeting Nisha and working with the wider group of young people seeing real life impacts on the ground that were having a positive impact, not only on children's lives, but their whole family and community's lives, really shaped me kind of going forwards and gave me a drive to be able to have a positive impact as a children's geographer on the spaces where young people live and their everyday experiences. And I'll return to this later on. In 2015, Dr. Christiana Zara and I lived in India for the best part of a year in a new urban development called Lavasa. This project was funded by the ESRC to look at new urbanisms in India. We conducted a large-scale ethnography with children and families living in this site of urban change. When I think about this particular experience, there are a few young people that really made an impact on me, and one of these was Aisha. Aisha had lived on the land since birth with her mum, her dad, and 2 brothers, with an outside tap, no toilet. She cooks with firewood. She was a really keen participant. She took part in 4 interviews across the project about different aspects of her life, as well as doing the app activity. We met Aisha in school, a school which had been provided by the Lavasa Corporation for all those with a claim to its land and its past. And the school and education was a critical point of tension in our research, which I'll say a bit more about in a second. I just want to say a bit more about the wider context to this. At the time of writing the funding bid, the Indian government was investing in 100 smart cities with an overemphasis on technical solutions to addressing the myriad of challenges which face urban India, from pollution to overcrowding, transportation, and water supply. And there were 4 approaches which the government was taking, whether that was retrofitting, redevelopment, greenfield sites, or whole pan-city approaches. And in this context at the time, there was limited evidence about how children and young people and their families were experiencing life within these smart cities. Private housing developments, indeed whole cities, were being planned and built and badged as smart. And it was in this context that this project was born. So during the fieldwork, both in our case study site and across India, there were huge challenges in the construction and the real estate sector, with large swathes of development remaining vacant. There were long-term delays to projects, rising costs of materials, mounting debts of the developers. So the lived experience of living on a building site had a profound experience for children and families. And the context of our research was Lavasa, this new city building initiative in the state of Maharashtra. A private-led development with 4 towns planned and 2 under construction. It was in this context that we wanted to consider how children, young people, and families were being planned for, ignored, positioned, negotiated in the neoliberal urban project. Over 350 people took part in this qualitative, multi-method research. 40 call families, did 160 interviews, and as I said, Christiana and I lived there, getting to know and living alongside our research participants. There are 2 core findings I wanted to mention here, and the first relates to water. This was an angle we hadn't expected to emerge from our findings, but a watery, wet, leaky geographies emerged across our data set. In analyzing this data, we were inspired by those using a feminist political ecology framework, a move from looking at water inequalities on a city-wide scale to a focus on the daily practices and fluid relations. In our paper on watery inequalities, we added to the literature on understanding the politics of water allocation in India, hydrological dystopias, and unequal access and control. In our reading around water, there's understandably an emphasis on water as a resource, which is clearly not surprising given the huge challenges which face people around the globe with poor water and sanitation supply. Thus, water resources internationally are high on the agenda, with the UN SDGs, number 6, campaigning for the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. However, we would argue that this could go further in understanding fluid relations and the geographies of inequalities which this sheds light on. So we used the paper to complicate our understanding of fluid inequality. And we noticed a distinct lack of research on water and the child. This isn't withstanding important research on their experiences of flooding. What do children's experiences of water add to the geographies of inequality? What are their watery priorities? And in writing this paper, we added to and drew attention to the depths, the rhythms, the flows of water to more understand those embodied watery relations. So where did this attention on water lead us? I'm just going to give one example. We can't speak about the materialities of water without a mention of the monsoon, a significant annual event by which crops, lives, moments, parties, events, prayers, humans and non-humans are organized. The monsoon was an enabler and a collective event. It brought together narratives, it brought together stories and myths, routines and mobilities. For many young people, the monsoon was part of their belonging to place. And for those who have lived in this region for generations, they knew its patterns, its nuances, its periodic spasms. The monsoon was talked about as if it was alive, as if it was a thing. When the rains arrived, there was a real energy in the atmosphere, and time was measured by the intensity of the green in the landscape and the depth of the water in the lakes. Across the seasons, the families would plan their days and their weeks and their months in line with the monsoon, how to walk, where to walk, when to go out, when to stay in. The strength of this rain had the capacity to shape bodies, practices, and environments. And it's deeply connected with inequalities in a number of ways. And this photograph is an important symbolization of that inequality. Here, the photograph shows a family business selling street food. But as you can see, life is precarious. Rain democratically falls over everyone, but the conditions which you live in determine the impact of that rain. So whilst the monsoon brought immense pleasure and rooted people in place, for many, the matter of rain accentuated a politics of difference, particularly in terms of accessibility and connection. Children talked about entire buildings and homes being washed away, roads being cut off from landslides, water seeping through the cracks in the wooden roofs, the mold growing up the walls. And for us, this photograph shows precarity and how this intersects with water. But it also importantly symbolizes an ongoingness, which many of our children and families spoke of. Putting up the sheeting, carrying on selling, carrying on playing, carrying on learning. However, despite this ongoingness, children and families spoke of the challenges of their bodies going on in the rain. They spoke about the fungal infections spreading up their legs during the rainy season, the difficulties of breathing due to mold spores in their homes, and the challenges of navigating the sticky mud on their way to school and work. The rain presents specific challenges for different socioeconomic groups, a point which then complicates our understanding of those watery inequalities. So this work and other material coming out of this project has enabled us to push thinking in terms of children's relationships with diverse natures and their geological relationships with the land. A second point I want to make about this work in Lavassa is about crisis and failure. And to do this, we need to know more about children like Aisha and her family. These families lived on the land of this development, and some had lived there for generations. They lacked opportunities and resources from the state. So in exchange for land, many families now rely on the developer for employment, for water, electricity, and housing. They tell us that before the development, they weren't eating properly. They didn't have access to clean water. However, with the arrival of Lavassa as a company, this created a situation of dependency, with children and families dependent on private infrastructures, which, when there's economic turmoil, the notion of responsibility and care is called into question. So throughout the 11-month fieldwork period, the developers went through multiple cycles of precarity and instability, which had a direct impact on the everyday lives of our research participants. And this Crisis is the result of an approach encouraging that dependency, which disempowered people, leaving them reliant on that private corporation for access to education, jobs, mobility, water, housing, some would say life itself. Essentially, young lives were governed and controlled through corporate responsibility. However, in reality, precarity was an everyday feature of existence for these families. So accounts of anxiety, worry, and stress really permeated our data. Participants spoke about being at the edge, at the cusp of something happening, and it was compounded by the changes in their lives which they experienced from the onset of the development. To lose everything, their education, their water, their jobs, would be like losing life. Christiana and I have written about embodied utopias and the everyday ways in which children, young people, and families experience urban change. And we reflect on a series of vulnerabilities related to citizenship, control, precarity, and performance. And we find that children's bodies are marginal to the building of this new city vision, but they themselves also are folded into this utopian dream. If now you were to Google Lavassa as a place, it wouldn't take too much searching to find that for years, the development, the corporation has been in trouble. Trouble with bankruptcy, trouble with environmental clearances and violations, and finding a new developer to take on the remnants of what's left. A narrative of failure really permeates these news reports and social media posts about the city. Some call it a ghost city. Other urban ramblers weave their way through empty buildings. When we were living there, despite the problems and the uncertainties, children and the families still had hope. So we're left wondering now in 2025, how these narratives of failure sit locally. What does failure feel like when you're Aisha, who had for most of her childhood experience of an urban life with the water, the electricity, and access to education? Where is Aisha and her family now? How does failure cross socioeconomic experiences or intergenerational relations? And we can ask failure for whom? And these are important questions if we're to understand the impact of urban transformation on young lives. So moving from India back to the UK, but on the same theme of urban development. Earlier, I reflected on Jessica, who I interviewed as part of the New Urbanism's New Citizens project, and the impact that this had on my approach to ethics. Now I want to return to this project to give an insight into two young people who show some critical issues relating to the planning of new urban developments in the UK, and why research with children in these contexts matters for the planning and the delivery of homes and communities. So first we meet Imran. He was 11 at the time of our research, and he and his family had just moved to the development we were researching. He had moved from inner city Northampton and was now living in this urban extension on the edge of town. And overnight, he told us that his mobility had significantly changed. The way the development was designed had a positive impact on his mobility, his own sense of safety and that of his parents. In this case, the design of the urban environment significantly supported his mobility. And we used GPS devices to map young people's mobilities in these new environments. In the holidays and at weekends, he was spending up to 6 hours a day playing out. And we write about this in a paper called Walking, Just Walking, where we make the case for why children's routine walking is so important. For many of our young people, it wasn't just a way of getting from A to B, from home to school or to the shop. It was a practice in and of itself, where young people were engaging with their environments. It was a practice, in this work, we really call for urban planners and policymakers to further recognize children's walking practices in their planning of urban spaces, to really prioritize safe and inclusive pedestrian environments. Next, we meet Savannah. And for her and her family, moving to this development was a lifeline, a new chance. She and her family live in social housing on the development. Across all of the communities that we've worked in, we found divisions between residents. between those who live in owner-occupied housing and those in housing association homes. How the allocation of housing is planned into developments is crucial, as is the build, as is the quality of the homes across the community. In my interactions with Savannah, she would speak of the victimization that she and her family experienced just because of her housing tenure status. Other children and families told me that the estate agents at the time of buying off that plot had been pinpointing the housing association homes and told them to avoid certain streets and certain areas. Inequalities and vulnerabilities were being built into these communities and narratives from the get-go, and young people's experience of this were frightening, intense, and unjust. So why do these experiences of children and young people matter? And I've listed quite a few reasons up on the slide. I'm just going to talk to two. So children and young people's experiences matter in the building of new homes and communities because they have a right to be safe. They have a right to be heard and to participate in the decisions which impact their lives. It's their mobility, it's their citizenship, their education, their living environment. So from the research that we've done, and others who are working in this field would say, if a community works for children and young people, then generally it does tend to work for everybody. During my time in one of the communities, I shadowed a PCSO during one of his shifts across a day in the school holiday. And the amount of calls that he got from one area of a community about antisocial behavior, or rather children playing out, was a really kind of stark insight into this. The way the streets had been designed was compounded with a lack of formalized play provision. And this meant that young people were playing on the street, which was having then an impact on everyone. So design these places right for children, and it will impact all. So where does this bring us to today? Much of my work over the past 10 years has been on children and young people's experiences of their communities. But most recently, Peter and I have been taking a more intergenerational lens on community building. Large-scale house building, as we all know, is on the political agenda here in the UK. And from our discussions with residents and key stakeholders, a focus on intergenerational futures is needed to learn from communities which have been built in the past 20 years, those that are being built now, and those that are in the pipeline. And I will just want to make 2 points from our latest research in planning for intergenerational futures. So similar to the work that we've done with young people, residents repeatedly told us that they felt that segregation had been planned into their community, particularly in terms of housing tenure, where different tenures were located, the design of the roads, the spatial layout of the place. Second, design features to democratize the street don't seem to be working. Whether it's irresponsible parking, speeding, or the silence of electric cars, or those simply not understanding the rules of the new roads, this all has an impact on resident experience. And third, residents told us about the lack of facilities that they've been promised to them in the build, the delays related to building of schools, to building of communal buildings, cafes, or opportunities to play. And fourth, we've seen that there's real problems arise when there's a lack of legibility in open spaces, and it can really cause tensions between generations. So more clarity is needed in terms of who owns what spaces and what they're for. Amongst professionals and residents, there was a call for further flexibility to be built into new housing developments, particularly enabling residents to age in place and to live well with one another across generations. Stakeholders and residents spoke about different examples of housing build design that would enable different generations of the same family to live together, to create dynamic, flexible spaces that could be reorganized as needs evolve. And it's also important to mention the need for multi-use public spaces which can enable diverse forms of recreation. These spaces and communities are vital for fostering conviviality, health, and well-being. And now we meet our final young person, John, age 10. So I met John a few months ago. I've been working with an interdisciplinary team on a project related to school streets. The work that I do isn't just about getting new build communities right, but it's about our existing communities too. The project is about school streets, so these are the designated roads outside of schools where motorized vehicles are temporarily restricted during drop-off and collection times. The aim being to create safer and more welcoming environments for children and families, whether it's to reduce congestion, for the safety of children, to encourage active travel, to lower air pollution, all of these to have a positive impact on health and well-being. So this project conducted a national evaluation of school street schemes, and we're just in the final stages, writing up the findings and the data. But I met John a few months ago. He's at a school here in Birmingham, and they've recently been designated as a school street. I was working with a group of young people to support us with the analysis of our data. And John came up to me and he said, Sophie, I'm not that comfortable with the activity that you've set. Can I do something else? So he decided he'd like to write a poem. So 10 minutes later, he handed me a bit of paper, and on it he wrote, streets crossing endless land and special roads to help me. Failure to cross the road, never seen again, ending the fear inside me. So as a young person with autism, he's reflected on the importance of the school street closure and the impact that that has had on his sense of safety. In just less than a month, I'll be returning to John and to his peers. We're running a collaborative art day with 600 pupils in that school. I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work. And then we'll do that, and in discussion with Birmingham City Council, the Active Travel team, and Sustrans, the aim is to use our research findings, the work that those young people do in that school, to then inform the design and the delivery of school streets across Birmingham and hopefully beyond. So I've shown across this presentation some of the impact that I've had locally in communities that I've worked in. And this localized impact is important to children and families, but so too is thinking about the multi-scalar opportunities for research impact. It was a privilege to be able to sit on the UN Habitat Global Expert Group for Sustainable Development Goal 11.3.2. It's a bit of a mouthful. So we were tasked with the preparation of an indicator framework. And a direct result of this means that it now makes direct reference to young people in the methodology of the indicator, which means national governments are now mandated to report on the participation of young people in urban planning and governance. The overall goal then being to ensure that marginalized groups aren't sidelined in making cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. At a national scale, I'm also proud of our engagement with Homes England, where Peter and I have worked closely with them in designing their national level guidance on including children and young people in designing garden villages and communities. And across England, we've both worked with local authorities, planners, and stakeholders to ensure that children's experiences of new developments are given due consideration. We regularly provide feedback on master plan designs, provide tailored recommendations to specific sites. And at the moment, we're collaborating with the TCPA on including young people in local planning processes. So where does this take me now? What's next for research with children and young people? And to show where this might go over the next few years, I've just got 5 quick statements. I promise they're quick. So first then, by 2050, 60% of the world's children globally are expected to live in urban settings. We know that urban challenges in cities disproportionately affect young children and young people, and this is only going to get more exaggerated with challenges faced by overcrowding. How do we make sure that our cities are safe for our children, given this wider context? I took this photograph earlier this year. I was with UN Habitat visiting one of the largest informal settlements in Nairobi. This children's park was previously a rubbish dump only a few months ago, well, prior to me visiting. How these children experience their city is important. particularly in a context where multiple intersecting challenges are prevalent. And of course, it's also important to mention, as estimated by UNICEF, the 473 million children who live in areas impacted by conflict, with 1 in 6 children globally experience displacement, violence, and horrific impacts of war on their lives. Children in these environments are the most vulnerable. The second statement, approximately 1 in 4 child deaths could be prevented by reducing environmental risks. As the World Health Organization states, children are particularly vulnerable to environmental risks, including air pollution, hazardous chemicals, inadequate water, sanitation, and hygiene. The playground I showed on the previous slide, you can see it up there, top left. Only tens of meters away is another dumping site, and even closer to a river, which the week after I was there, flash floods in Nairobi wiped out part of this community. These places, these childhoods are vulnerable to extreme environmental threats. So working with interdisciplinary teams on air quality or sanitation, for example, is vital for children's lives. The third statement brings me to the UK, where the UK government plans to build 1.5 million homes in England by 2029. From the research we've been doing over the years here at Birmingham, we have the knowledge and expertise on how we can design, shape, develop places which benefit long-term community building. This work on new build communities is underpinned by a broader statement. There are over 9 million children aged 0 to 18 in England, and 25% of those are eligible for free school meals. It's not just the building of new places that matters. We need to be getting our communities right for all children. There are 9 million children just in England that deserve to grow up in an environment that makes them feel safe and supports their physical, emotional, and social well-being. And children's geographers have a critical role to play here. Which leads me on to the final statement. England doesn't have a national play strategy. And while I'm not an expert or a specialist on children's play, the importance of children's opportunities to play cross-cuts the data I've collected across projects, across countries, and across childhoods. Across the country, academics, professionals, and parents have all been advocating for a national strategy for play. And in June, the Raising the Nation Play Commission published a major report calling for further action to reclaim childhood through play. And with colleagues, I'm currently awaiting the outcome of a large grant, which will, if successful, be instrumental in understanding how we can shape children's play opportunities via national level policy on play. So these 5 statements cover key challenges related to young people. And key to all of these are the environments which young children are growing up in. I can't say too much more about the projects I've applied for, as hopefully you will hear pretty soon. But what I can say is that the future of my research is certainly collaborative, and it's certainly interdisciplinary. With colleagues in health, applied health, engineering, psychology, nanoscience, where are you, Isolde? There. Are just some of the ways that I'll be pushing forward new agendas and new directions in children's geographies, addressing critical intersecting challenges which face children's lives. But I also thought it was important to mention the ones that got away. I just wanted to acknowledge the huge amount of work that goes into idea development and funding applications that don't make the cut. On the one hand, I've had great successes with research funding, but on the other, there have been quite a few that didn't get funded. This here is a screenshot of my applications folder, all of these since 2018. Some of these are small, some of these are multi-million-pound grants. We all apply for grants at different times for different reasons. Perhaps the team is right, perhaps a funding opportunity has come along, perhaps we've been approached by a team we haven't worked with before, but we really believe in an idea and the difference a project will make. Quite a few of these, I've been deeply upset by the outcome. Some have got through to the very final stage, the very final few. I knew that they were good and I really believed in them. Yes, I've been disappointed, but you have to remember all of the work that goes into these grant proposals And it's all part of our collective and individual stories of who we are, where we've got to, and where we're going. These ideas and collaborations on the screen will reform in other places. We'll try again, and perhaps next time they'll go over the line. I remember working out a few years ago, this was before we were all working on Google Docs and shared documents. And I looked at some emails in one of my grant folders, and it took over 1,000 emails to write a grant. A huge amount of work, ideas, of thinking, and of collaboration. None of that is a waste. It's all part of our collective ambition to work towards a better, healthier, happier childhoods. Before I end, I just wanted to acknowledge all of those who I've collaborated with and those who have funded my research. I'm grateful to you all. And it's also important to mention those who are enablers of research: the schools, the governors, the youth leaders, the administrators, the finance teams, and of course, the children and families whose stories have shaped this lecture. Thank you.
How do I follow that? My goodness. Sophie, thank you so much. I'll quickly introduce myself so you know who's speaking to you, and then I'll get on with some thanks. I'm Dominic, and I'm one of the human geography staff in the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences. I'm also the university's Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research Impact, which sounds a lot more grand than it is. But as part of that job, it's been a real pleasure to see the impact that Sophie's work has had. And, she's described it in quite brief terms here, but really the impact of this work is staggering for the children whose lives she has influenced in the work that she's been doing. But I wanted just to give a very few words of reflection and thanks, and I realise that I am standing in between you and a drinks and nibbles reception in the Lapworth, so I'll try and keep this brief. Firstly, just to say that lectures like this, inaugurals, are a really, really rare chance for us as academic colleagues to really understand what it is that our colleagues do. And I've known Sophie in the 12 years since she's been here at the university, and I thought I knew what she did. But really, I only knew small nuggets of it. And I think as academics, we get accustomed to reading kind of short versions of the research that our colleagues do, but it's been fascinating this evening to hear about the ways in which one project led to the next, particularly the way for me that Sophie's work, as she's explained, is both interrogating really critical theoretical questions, but also paying really close attention to the things that matter to people, and particularly those young people. And I think we heard lots about the individuals with whom she has worked and the way that they've influenced how she thinks. And although she didn't say this evening, I want you to know that she takes that passion for research and that care for the people that she's doing research with into the classroom here at the university, and it has inspired generations of our students as well. And I'm sure that many of those will think of her in just the way that she thinks about Mrs. Prescott, was it, who inspired her all those years back at school. It's been a really fascinating journey this evening to hear the way that Sophie's life and work have been intertwined. And having got to know her a bit over the last few years, I'm not at all surprised about the diaries, the notes, the keeping of letters, and that very, very neatly bound project. I thought, that's absolutely Sophie, isn't it? Completely. Did it get 20 out of 20? I mean, obviously it did. Good God. Sophie sets the bar for all of us, and we all try our best and fail to live up to it. Sophie's the only person, I think, whoever could have, and I'm not sure if I'm not allowed to share this or not, could have researched, written and published a book whilst on mat leave. I mean, who manages to do this? Quite amazing. Typically, modestly, she sees herself as a product of collaboration, mentoring, firsts, and it's absolutely typical of her to be so generous with the acknowledgement of that input. But I guarantee that a huge number of people including those people on the slide that you saw at the beginning, including me, a much younger me on that slide, would also point to the ways in which Sophie has influenced them, both in what she does, but more in how she does it, with kindness and integrity, as I'm sure that you could see. And also it's really clear to see, as I mentioned at the beginning, the real difference that Sophie's work has made for children's lives. And she's pointed out very clearly at the end of the talk this evening how very important that work will be as we go forward. She's made very clear the challenges that we face in children's urban lives going forward, and really her work has never been more needed. Sophie, congratulations. You deserve your chair more than anything. It's been a fantastic talk this evening, and I'm sure everyone would like to join me in giving you a round of applause again. So, the Lapworth waits for you. I'm sure that those who are new to the campus can be guided on their way there, but please do join us. Thank you.